a number of books through the years at the library next to my home, and some I held close to my chest, so dear, but they were always on loan. But if the pages make me smile like a fool, maybe for once I won't follow the rules. I'll keep it until it's long overdue. When I find my favorite book to read, I've read a story that opened my eyes to the world and its passing tide, and another one sang a sweet song to my heart, but the ending was sad from the start. And then came along just an ordinary book that I happened to give a second look. It was humor and heartbreak and something in between, the most beautiful one I'd ever seen. And your pages made me smile like a fool. Maybe for once I won't follow the rules. I'll keep you until you're long overdue. Oh, I found my favorite book to read. So I'll pour over you till I know you by heart. And when time wears you down, I'll mend your broken parts, and I'll treasure the days with you that I'm spending. I'm still waiting to read your ending. And your pages make me smile like a fool. And for once I didn't follow the rules. I'm keeping you till you're long overdue. You're my favorite book to read. Na, 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 na. You're my favorite book to read.
Welcome back to the Melius Performance Podcast. Today I am joined by Dr. Ross Di Corleto. I've known Ross for 10 years or more. We worked together previously in a past life in a mining company. Ross has a PhD in the area of occupational hygiene or industrial hygiene if you're US based. In this episode, I talked to Ross about what is occupational hygiene, industrial hygiene, the benefits for our workplace, and we also delve into some of the topics that Ross is interested in, particularly around heat stress and risk management. Pretty interesting conversation. It's a new subject that we haven't actually broached on the podcast, so it might be of interest for those of you who are very interested in occupational health and safety. But if not, there's always something to get out of these episodes. If you're athletes as well, or coaches in regards to heat stress, some stuff here and some good resources here that Ross has in relation to thermal stress management. If you want to get in contact with Ross, just scroll on there to the show notes and you can see his website and contact details and so on. And if you Google his name as well, you'll find him on some other podcast episodes that you can have a listen to as well if you're interested in getting in touch or listening to more about Ross's work. As always, you can follow us at meliusconsulting.com.au. We're up on Twitter at meliusperform, over on Instagram, meliusperform. And if you have any feedback on the podcast or you have any questions you'd like to submit, ian.dunican at meliusconsulting.com.au. That's MELIUS. Head over to the website as well for lots of free information, podcast, blogs, and to find out more about the services and solutions we offer. If you are enjoying the podcast, please leave us a review on iTunes or where you get your podcasts. Be much appreciated. And here is Dr. Ross Di Corleto. Welcome back to Media's Performance Podcast. Today I am joined by my old friend. Well, I shouldn't say old friend. Well, he is an old friend, but my young friend as well. Is Ross Di Corleto. We've had some adventures, Ross, in our days. We were just reminiscing before we started recording. How are you today?
Very good, thanks, Ian. Yes, it's been a few years since we first strolled down some streets.
So for history of people, if we're talking about some stuff, Ross and I both used to work for a large mining company. We both worked in the corporate health and safety team on the health side. So there was a few people that were like medical doctors, a couple of occupational hygienists. There was one guy that was like a wellness guy, and then I was like the fatigue human performance dude. And Ross was in that team. So myself and Ross have, collaborated in that team in, all over the world and sort of, supported each other in that area. And Ross was in that area before I joined, and Ross is an occupational hygienist. So which doesn't mean that you clean toilets, Ross. That's correct? Is that?
That's correct. Yeah,
that's correct.
It's an unfortunate title, occupational hygiene. It gives that connotation that I've been to dinner parties when you say, well, "What do you do?" "Oh, I'm an occupational hygienist," and you get that knowing look. "Oh, yeah, this guy's he cleans toilets or whatever, or teaches people how to wash their hands." But no, it's a great profession. It's a scientific-based profession, obviously, and people in our ranks come from they can be chemists, industrial chemists, engineers. Allied health, OTs have started in that profession, and they go back and they do a postgrad in occupational hygiene, whether it's a master's or something of that nature, and then they go on to develop up in the area of occupational hygiene. It's when I try to explain it to people, it's about looking after the health of the worker. So we assess the work environment to help control those exposures and minimize those exposures. And if I guess in 3 words, what we do is we're there to prevent worker harm. So, and that's basically what we do. Yeah. So it doesn't involve toilet brushes at all.
That was a bit of a tongue-in-cheek comment, because lots of people would say that about occupational hygiene. What do you mean, like to clean toilets? I was like, oh.
No, I've copped that quite a few times.
What would be a better title, Ross? You've been in this area for quite a while. What do you think would be a better title to have?
I think something in relation to the work environment. So a work environment health specialist or work environment scientist or something. A number of magazines. For example, the Annals of Occupational Hygiene. Yeah, it's changed their name. They're now the Journal of Worker Health.
Really?
So they're looking down that path. Yeah. So I think that better describes what we do, because we're almost, my son's in the field as well, and I asked him, how does he describe what occupational hygiene is? And he said, well, one of the ways you can do it is remember the old TV show CSI? Yeah, that's what we do. We go out into the where the incident has happened, and we investigate. We use scientific instruments, and we use deduction and problem solving, and we come to a conclusion to help prevent it from happening again. So that's the sort of thing we're doing. It's a fascinating field. No 2 days are ever the same.
Yeah.
In my career, I've been fortunate enough to, as you know, to travel all over the world practicing my profession. It's been brilliant.
Yeah. So Ross, how did you get into this? Because it is an interesting. It's not like you go to school, and you're a teenager and you're 15 or 16 and you're sitting there looking out the window and going, I'd like to be an occupational hygienist to prevent worker harm, Yeah. I often think this about myself. I didn't look out the window and go, I'd like to be a sleep scientist / chronobiologist. I couldn't even spell like sleep, never mind chronobiology. So how did you come to this? What sort of education and experience brought you to this?
Right. It was quite by accident. I started off working in the laboratory as a scientific assistant, and I went back to school and did my undergrad in applied chemistry. And I was working in a power station, and our role was basically, maintaining water quality and coal quality in the mines and whatever, and testing that. And it was in the late 70s when asbestos started to become a big issue. And the engineers in the power industry was going, well, what's this asbestos stuff? I mean, we don't know anything about it. It's not engineering. Give it to the chemists. So it got lumped down into the lab, and we started doing a bit of work in there. And as I got into it, the asbestos, it was reasonably interesting. But then we started to look at other areas, noise and dust and all that. And I thought, hey, this is interesting. So then from there, I went back to uni and picked up some additional qualifications and sort of fell into the role. I've never looked back. It's I didn't know what an occupational hygienist was at the time. I didn't even know I was doing occupational hygiene. I thought I was just doing this sort of unusual chemistry work, and I enjoyed it and stayed with it.
And at that time, Ross, was occupational hygiene a defined, role? Was it like a profession, we'll say, already, or
I think it was really emerging. If you look at the actual Institute of Occupational Hygiene, it sort of started to really evolve in the 80s, and the likes of Gersh Major and Pamela De Silva, who were the leading lights in the field, they started to develop the profession, but it wasn't really a well-known profession. And there was a 13-week course done in I think it was the University of New South Wales, but that was about it. And then from there it evolved, and in more recent times it's grown. In the UK and in the US, obviously established before then, going right back. But I don't know if they were really called occupational or industrial hygienists, but there was a sort of profession there.
So what's the difference, Ross, between an industrial hygienist and an occupational hygienist? Or is there a difference?
One's American, one's Aussie or a POM. That's the difference.
People are going, which is which?
That's right. Well, the industrial hygienist...
Send your answers on a postcard to P.O. Box.
Americans call them industrial hygienists, and some of the South American countries and some of the Asian countries call them industrial hygienists.
Yeah.
Those, the British, the South Africans, the Australians, we tend to call them occupational hygienists. Identical, all identical.
Ross, you said earlier on that people come from lots of different backgrounds and professions into occupational hygiene. Is there a set of common skills that people need to be an occupational hygienist? Do they need to be scientifically minded, really good at maths, really good at writing, bit of everything? Yeah. Or do people come with different skill sets for different areas?
They do come with different skill sets, but there is a core requirement. You do need to have some an understanding or education, shall we say, in the hard sciences. So it really is a benefit if you've done physics, chemistry, and those sorts of subjects, because if you're looking at things like, exposures to hazardous chemicals, toxicology can be quite useful. You need that understanding of chemistry. If you're looking at heat and noise and ventilation, you need understanding of physics and all those sorts of things. So you do need a hard science background. But having said that, I've got a colleague that started as a botanist and went on to become a very successful hygienist. And geologists and OTs have gone into the field. It's just how they develop. It's the problem-solving part that is the most important part, is that understanding. But yes, you do need some hard science behind you.
It's interesting, Ross, because, and you would probably feel the same about this as well. And I find this is interesting when you speak to people and you try to explain about, subject matter area. So if you look at health and safety broadly, people go, oh, health and safety, it's just an area. But then you break that down, you further divide it, and we'll take health, for example. We can further break health down into things like occupational medicine, occupational hygiene, or industrial hygiene. We can break it down into the wellness or the allied, whatever health, whatever way you want to call it. And then you break down occupational hygiene again, and you're even taking there, there's noise, there's vibration, there's dust, there's thermal stress, there's toxicology. It's further again and further again and further again. It is such because even as an occupational hygienist, you would think from the outside, you would think that's a very specialist area. But even within that, there's specialities within that again. So it must be very difficult. You have to be kind of quite broad across a lot of subjects. But then some people are quite deep, like yourself, which we'll talk about in a moment. Like you're quite broad, but you also have a speciality in thermal stress.
Mm-hmm.
So like, how hard is that to cultivate that knowledge? Is it kind of a continuous, education process every year to stay on top of it? Is it one of those kind of professions where you just never feel like you're reaching expert level?
I think you're right. You do have to have a generalist knowledge across a number of the different fields, as you mentioned, and that's important. You need to have enough knowledge to know where to go if you're not sure about something. If you go into the specialist areas, sometimes that can be quite challenging because you're right. You have to be constantly on top of things, reading papers, and looking at new technology. I mean, that's happening at the moment. All this new technology, real-time monitoring and personal monitoring that sends things up to the cloud. I mean, I'm testing one at the moment. So you have to keep on board. I've been in the field in the game now for over 40 years, but every day I learn something new, and you have to keep on board. You just tend to specialize in an area that you find that you enjoy. And for me, it happened to be, heat stress or thermal environment and, critical risk management. They're the two areas I enjoy, and I spend more time looking at those.
So Ross, you did your PhD in that area of, thermal environment, thermal stress. What made you kind of pick that area to get into? Was it something you were doing in work, or was it just you had a bit of a fascination with it, or is it the fact that you live in Queensland?
I was actually
all of the above.
I did my master's of research in heat stress, but I did my PhD in biological monitoring for carcinogen exposure. The reason I got into heat stress was purely by chance. I shifted from from Victoria to Queensland, in a very new role. I knew absolutely nothing about heat stress. And I was walking into the plant one day, and to walk into this particular site, you had to walk past the medical centre. And I was walking in, and as I was walking in, the managing director was in front of me, and he stopped because an ambulance pulled up, our site ambulance, and they were pulling someone out of the back of the ambulance. And we stopped him in front of it, and he looked over and he asked the ambulance driver, what was the problem? He said, we think that he suffered heat stroke or heat exhaustion. And he looked over to me and he said, well, what do you know about heat stress, Ross? I said, no, not a lot. I came from Victoria. And he said, well, you're going to become an expert. So I got told what I was going to do. So off I went, and I started my master's by research. And so that's how it started. And I enjoyed it. I loved it and kept at it.
And so, Ross, how would you define, let's say, heat stress or thermal stress? What is it? Because lots of people say, oh, I'm heat stressed, or there might be a little bit hot, or, people come over to Australia for holidays, like my dad last year, who nearly died when he got here when it was 40 degrees. We've all had those stories, or people go up north or go to these hot areas. Mm-hmm. What exactly is thermal stress or heat stress?
I think you need to define two terms.
Okay.
One term is heat stress or thermal stress, and the other one is heat strain or thermal strain. Right?
Strain, yep.
So heat stress is the impact of the heat, humidity, workload, the clothing you're wearing, all those sorts of things. They create a heat stress on the body. Okay. Now the body reacts to that heat strain via thermal strain. It shows thermal strain by increasing the sweat rate, or increased core temperature, or increased heart rate. So that's a thermal strain as a result of the heat stress. Now, the other thing too is if you talk to people and you say to them, and I often do it in the training sessions, explain to me when someone is under heat stress, and they say, they get cramps, they're dehydrated, they faint, or they get heat exhaustion or heat stroke. And that, in effect, is really the top of the pyramid. If you look at thermal strain from the start, right at the very base, what you get is this initial fatigue or lethargy. If you go to some of these hot, humid areas, that you really feel quite lethargic and tired quite often. If you do nothing about it, it next moves up to another level where it starts to impact on productivity. And there's actually some brilliant studies being done recently by, I think it's the University of Thessaly in Greece, where they look at the impact on productivity. And there's quite a significant drop. And they're estimating just roughly, for every for every degree WBGT, which is just a measure, centigrade, above 25 degrees, they're seeing up to 2% reduction in productivity. So it's quite a significant impact. And in that area too, it's not always as necessarily thermal stress. It can also be, or thermal strain, it can also be thermal discomfort. So they're the initial parts. If you keep ignoring it, you start to see an impact on cognitive function. And that can be quite significant. And, there are studies recently done, University of Adelaide, and there's some work being done by NIOSH in Washington State that's showing that the more you get into this area, the impact, it also results in increased injuries in safety incidents. So that's already you're starting to see this impact, a much broader impact. After that, if you still do nothing, then you start to get into the symptoms that we're familiar with, the cramps and the dehydration and that, and then eventually the exhaustions and the strokes. So it's quite a continuum from the bottom on all the way up. So you start with thermal discomfort or thermal comfort, and then get into the increased thermal strain and the serious illnesses.
So, Ross,
sorry.
So go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, and of course, that doesn't even talk about chronic illness, which we can mention.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, is there any particular set of factors that influence your sort of at-risk factors for developing thermal stress or thermal strain, such as, ethnic background, myself being, translucent nearly, like a newborn tadpole. What about body weight? What about body fat? What about, I don't know, eye color, hair color? Is there any sort of set of factors that predetermine someone's risk profile? We often see this in different areas, body fat percentage, body fat distribution. You might give you a risk of XYZ outcomes. BMI is a very crude measure that's used a lot of times for, type 2 diabetes risks, sleep apnea, cardiovascular disease, and so on. Do we have any of those set of factors where we can screen people or look at sort of in a crude way of binning people for factors?
There are. The impact varies from individual to individual as well. And you're right. There's things like age, fitness, general health, medications. There are numerous medications that impact on heat stress, and particularly illicit drugs. Again, the methamphetamines and the cocaines and the like impact on the thermal, the hypothalamus and thermal control mechanisms within the body. So there are those aspects. The BMI, hypertensive individuals may be more exposed. So as an individual, yes, there are a number of factors, and there's some guidance out there that shows you what to screen for when you do pre-employment medicals for that sort of predisposition. If you've had a serious heat illness in the past, you will be more than likely will become predisposed to having it again. So that's another aspect that you need to look at. And then, that's the individual. That's a heap of variables there.
Oh, lots, yeah.
Then you've got Then you've got the
what was that?
That was Siri that turned on for some unknown reason.
They're always listening, Ross. Yeah. They're always listening.
So, it's very disconcerting. Then you've got obviously the work environment, so the different temperatures, different humidities, how hard you're working, different workloads. So if I'm a supervisor with a clipboard, I'm generating a certain amount of internal metabolic heat load, which is not really high, probably about the same as one of the old-fashioned 100-watt light globes. But if I'm swinging a pick and shovel or a sledgehammer, then I'm generating a lot of metabolic heat that I have to dispose of, and that's going to impact as well. And then, so that's two variations. So you got the individual, you've got the work environment, and then you've got the task itself. So there's three variables that you have to keep in mind, and all of those impact on the risk factors for heat stress and heat strain.
So Ross, you mentioned there about if you had a thermal stress incident before. What about people will say, in work sites, not only on work sites, but even in sporting activities as well. You just need to get used to it. The more times you expose yourself to it, the better you're going to get at it. As in terms of managing heat stress. Is there any truth behind that, or is that just, bullshit, really?
No, there is some truth behind that. That's the concept of acclimatization. And there is significant benefits for someone that's acclimatized. And it's something that we look at when we, for example, we look at workplace procedures for heat stress and the like. One of the areas that's often forgotten about is heat acclimatization, thermal acclimatization. And one of the few collapses that I've witnessed was as a result of someone not being acclimatized. It was quite an unusual scenario. This gentleman was working at 32 degrees, jackhammering some scale off a vessel, and he collapsed. And young, fit. And when we were doing the incident investigation, we said to the supervisor, we don't understand. He's done this job many, many times. Why all of a sudden did this happen? And he said, I don't understand it either, because he'd just been on 2 weeks leave, so he'd come back and he would have been well rested. So we gave him the toughest job on the day. And I said, okay, well, where did he go for leave? He said, he's in Queenstown skiing. So here's a guy being in Queenstown for 2 weeks, and then he came back to site, and he was, he didn't quite adapt. He wasn't acclimatized. But getting back to the actual the physiological process, there are a number of things that change. You get your increased the lowering of your heart rate because you get an improved stroke of the heart, the efficiency of the heart. Your exercise capacity increases. Your sweat rate increases, because one of the body's key mechanisms for cooling is the evaporation of sweat off the skin. So we sweat more, air blows over it, it evaporates. You get that cooling effect, dilated blood vessels in the skin, because the heart's now pumping a lot stronger, and you get a cooling of the core temperature. So that happens. And there's a hormone in the body that develops called aldosterone, and that reduces the amount of salts in your sweat. So although you're sweating more, you're losing less salts. So that's another adaptation. So you're improving your sweating, you're reducing the loss of salts, your heart rate's better. There's all these things, and plasma volume tends to increase and then levels off a bit as well. So all these things are happening. They don't happen straight away. You'll find that I think it's about 7 days, 90% of those adaptations will occur, and you're fully acclimatized over 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And then you can start to lose that after about 4 to 5 days. So yes, there is definitely, the body does adapt. And in the early days in the platinum mines in South Africa, which were quite deep and quite hot, before the guys would come on site, they would do a time in the acclimatization chamber to get them used to that temperature, and that's how they used to get them adapted. So yes, there is scientific evidence to it, definitely.
We see a lot of this happening now in sports as well. A lot of people using heat chambers, to promote adaptation before going to an event. We also see it as well. We've seen it. We've spoken about it in this podcast, but we see it in combat sports when people are trying to dehydrate and lose, water weight before an event as well, using thermal stress to do that. I suppose then the other thing, Ross, is do people never get used to it? Like, people often say to me when I go, I've been here for nearly 20 years in Australia, and I go, Jesus, it's hot today. People go, oh, well, you can't handle it because you're Irish. It's like, well, I've been here for nearly 20 years. So I think that's the case. Do some people never be able to get used to it? Are they always going to struggle, or do they just go home back to Ireland? Like, I suppose is the question.
I'm not a physiological expert, but my understanding of it is that most people can adapt, but they adapt to different extents.
Yeah.
So, and as I said, there's also that factor of thermal comfort as well. Some will tolerate the discomfort more than the others. So you will adapt to some extent. Some will adapt better than others, and some you'll find as they get fitter, they do get better acclimatized and more effective. I'm not sure if there's a situation where you just never adapt, but I think the body does learn lessons and adapt to some extent. Just we're all individuals. We'll adapt differently.
Yeah. I just laugh, like I lived in the Pilbara where I get like 45. So, if I was able to function up there, it's okay. I think people just like saying it to me because I'm pasty white, but so it's just a,
Yeah, it was interesting. Last year during one of the heat waves, they interviewed a gentleman from Coober or Lightning Ridge, one of those opal places, and he was shaking. He said, an old timer, and he said, "Oh, gee, when it gets down to 35 degrees, that's when I put my jumper on." Okay, I don't know if that's quite the case, but yeah, I think living a number of years that they start to adapt. But they also need to be careful because what we're now starting to see is a growing increase in chronic illness related to heat from people living in some of those areas and working in those areas. So there is a balance.
That was one of the questions I had for you was actually what's the, we talk about exposure over time. Is there when you have that chronic exposure for 40 years living in a hot climate, does that lead to then, negative health outcomes? And if so, what are they? So like, what would you see if somebody was living in a Coober Pedy or a Pilbara region or a really hot area of Australia, for example, for 40 years? What tends to happen?
In the long term, those sorts of really long-term jobs, we start to see the appearance of skin diseases because of the constant sweating and, the clogging of the skin and that. Sleep disturbance is another one. It's not unusual. There's one called psychoneurosis, which I think is like goantropo. It is a actual tropal lethargy that almost, constant feeling of tiredness. Kidney stones, we're seeing a growing increase in kidney stones.
Really?
Yeah. There's some studies done recently in the steel industry, in glass industry, and we're starting to see a significant increase in uric stones workers presenting with kidney stones. And there's a new one that's come out. I can't remember what it's called. It's got a really weird name. Mesonephropathy. Mesoamerican nephropathy. And it's a chronic kidney disease that they've discovered predominantly in the South Americas, but they're starting to see it in Asia as well. And it's an epidemic of chronic kidney disease. They're not 100% sure what's causing it, but they know it's related to dehydration. They also think there could be some relationship to a breakdown of sucrose and fructose, some of the sugars, and the way that the metabolites are formed. And they're seeing some really significant increases in kidney disease. There's a meta study done. What was his name? Jay Sakara did one last year, and showing an increase in Africa and Egypt and some of the Southern Asian countries. So that's becoming a real concern.
And that was a meta-analysis.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for anybody who doesn't know what a meta-analysis is, basically to take a bunch of papers together and then they take all the data together and they analyze that data. So it might have 20 studies, kind of like a systematic review, but they take all that data and then they actually, calculate the average, the standard deviation of all those studies together to look at the effect sizes. So it's actually a really good thing to do because it's a really, like, in terms of top level of science compared to like on the bottom level, we'll say, of the shittiest science, somebody writing a blog, right? That's a completely opinion based. And then you move up like observational studies, intervention based studies, randomized controlled, systematic reviews. Meta-analysis is like the pinnacle because you're taking lots of really good studies and putting them together. So that's really good then if it's a meta-analysis is the point I'm trying to make here.
Yeah, so there's some of this, and they're showing, as I said, they're showing this increase in kidney disease, which is a real concern. So we're now trying to educate people in that, you might think it's only a short-term thing and I've got some dehydration, I've got a bit of a headache in the morning or some cramps, but continuously doing that over a period of time is going to impact on the body. And,
So Ross, a question there is, like, in these environments that are really hot, particularly in Australia, if you look at places like Darwin or the Pilbara and so on, these mining, oil and gas type towns, a lot of people drink a lot of alcohol. Mm-hmm. And so it's very hot as well. So people do like a cold beer at the end of the day, and you can't begrudge someone a cold beer at the end of like a 45-degree day and working hard.
Yeah.
Is that actually then potentially they're kind of, we'll say their health factors? So apart from the environment, apart from their kind of physiological makeup, then they're kind of, we'll say, their habits and behaviors. Was that also like a confounding factor here, where if they're drinking lots of alcohol, it's leading to dehydration, then coupled with the heat, coupled with the physiology, it's just exacerbating these type of kidney diseases? Because lots of what you spoke about there was kind of kidney and dehydrated related. Or is it the same in people who have never drank alcohol? I know it's probably hard to find out probably now with limited studies, but what do you think may be going on there with that relationship?
Well, yeah, it's a difficult one. I think, well, obviously, as you mentioned, the issue with the alcohol is the dehydration factor.
Yeah.
Generally, they say for every glass you drink, you tend to pee out a glass and a half. It gives a whole.
It's a glass and a half in every pound of Cadbury's chocolate.
That's right. Well,
that's milk, though.
A glass and a half of water goes out for every glass of alcohol you drink. So, and we found we've done studies in mining camps and in smelters and the like, and guys will go back and they'll have a beer, but they forget to rehydrate, and they'll come to work in the morning already, with massively dehydrated, and they never actually catch up. They're constantly behind the eight ball.
Yeah.
So that's one of the factors. As to, I haven't really looked in depth at the actual the direct relationship between alcohol intake and kidney disease, and I dare say there's probably a direct relationship between that and obviously liver disease. But with kidney disease, no, I haven't really gone into that. There was a study done in Venezuela in 2013, Jimenez, I think it was, who looked at the consumption of what they call sodas.
Yeah.
Which were a lot of the sugar-based, the corn syrup-based drinks, and they were finding that they believe that now that there is a relationship between rehydrating using some of these corn syrup-based drinks and kidney disease. But alcohol-wise, no, I couldn't comfortably answer that one. I haven't.
Yeah. That's okay. It was just a bit of a speculation. And then a pretty sideways question off that, Ross, then again, completely speculative here. So I don't feel like if you don't know the answer, it's okay. Is energy drinks, because we're seeing lots and lots of energy drinks, being consumed, and we see a negative impact in the workplace environment for, like, we'll say sleep, for example, because they're so full of caffeine and taurine. We see it then for people getting headaches. We see it then for people using it as a kind of a pre-workout. We see people mixing it with alcohol as well. Is that another one that would severely dehydrate people potentially?
Well, that doesn't necessarily dehydrate. I did some work with a colleague of mine that I used to work with. He was a nutritionist in Canada, and we looked at. You
can say his name. He's not Voldemort or Harry Potter. I think if you say his name, it's okay.
That's all right.
Is it our friend? Our old friend?
Our old friend, yes.
Oh, we'll do a shout out. He might be listening. Gianni, if you're listening,
Gianni Scalzo.
We love you, Gianni.
Yeah, based in Montreal. So Gianni helped me out because I was looking at this impact of caffeine. And so he did some research, helped me out with the research. And we actually found that caffeine is not a big factor.
Interesting.
And a lot of athletes do use caffeine prior to events, and in the Olympics, it's not unusual. So what they're finding is that caffeine tends to be more of a diuretic for those that are less active, so office workers and those sorts of people. There is some people do have an individual disposition to caffeine having that diuretic effect, but in general, it's not as bad as I first thought it was. There was a study done by Armstrong in the 80s where all this evolved from, and he actually went back and redid the study. And if you read the study, without being too scientific, there were some limitations to it. And he's gone back and he's reviewed it, and he's come back with these limitations and said, well, actually, it didn't prove that. So caffeine, to say that don't drink caffeine, it's a diuretic, it's just the consensus is starting to be that, well, maybe that's not the case. However, there is a case for, as you said, headaches. Tachycardia is another one that's starting to make an appearance. You do need to be careful with those drinks. And if you think about the drinks, they're not very big, are they? Most of the sports drinks, well, apart from a couple I've seen, are small cans. So they don't add much to the fluid balance anyway. You're probably better off having a small cup of normal cup of wheat tea that have just as efficient an effect, but you don't get the same buzz.
Yeah. Ross, if we kind of look at more the occupational environment, we'll say for a second, we see a lot of times in construction, for example, lots of construction sites will say once it gets to a certain temperature, we're going to close down, or certain companies will we don't enforce long sleeve and long pants here because of thermal stress. Wearing long clothing, makes it worse.
Yeah.
What would you say to companies, whether it be construction or rail or mining or oil and gas, that have those sort of rules in place around a temperature cutoff and or a clothing policy?
Yeah, actually, it's interesting because I've just finished doing some work in that area for some companies, and there's two things you need to look at. First of all, if you go for a cutoff in temperature-wise, that can be a real issue, because if I'm working at 30 degrees and it's 25% humidity and I've got a good breeze blowing, I can work at that temperature all day without any adverse effect.
Yeah.
If I'm working at 30 degrees and it's 95% humidity and there's no air circulation whatsoever, you're almost guaranteed of having some thermal strain issues. So by saying a certain cutoff temperature, you're potentially putting people at risk. So to avoid that, you then have to become very, very conservative. So you have to keep dropping that temperature to protect everybody. Because remember, you have to protect the weakest link in the group. So if someone is, has a BMI of 40 or higher or whatever, they've got a heart condition, and you're saying, well, our cutoff temperature is 30 degrees, well, you could be putting that individual at significant risk. And it doesn't matter how you drop it off. It just becomes impractical eventually. I've noticed, I have seen some companies have gone that path. I would just say be very careful, because you're not necessarily protecting everyone in the group. There are, as we mentioned earlier on in this discussion, there are too many factors that impact on the thermal strain on an individual. And for you to pick out one of these and say, this is going to protect me, I would say be very, very careful. In relation to the long sleeve and short sleeve, yes, there is a difference, because what we're doing is by putting long sleeves on, you're reducing the amount of skin that is able to effectively evaporate sweat. But then you've also got to look at, well, how much are we reducing it by? And you can actually model that using some international standards, predicted heat strain standards, which allows you to put in, if I'm wearing this type of ensemble with short sleeves and short trousers, or long sleeves and long trousers, and I'm working at this rate and this temperature at this air velocity, and you can calculate a predicted core temperature rise. And I've done this on a number of occasions, and generally there is a very small impact. For one particular task I did recently, over a number of the hottest days of the month up here in Queensland, we saw an increase of 0.1 degrees centigrade over a day's work. 0.1 is virtually nothing. So there is an impact. Often it's thermal comfort. People do feel uncomfortable wearing long sleeves compared to short sleeves, so you need to consider that. So that's where workers are seeing the benefit. Oh, it's short sleeve, therefore I feel more comfortable. You get better focus, better cognitive function in some cases. But as for someone to say, if you make me go from short sleeve to long sleeves, I'm going to be suffering from thermal strain that's going to result in an illness. No, not quite. It's more a comfort thing. Right. And the other thing there's always another thing with heat stress. If you're working out in the sun, or you're working in a smelter or your foundry, or a bakery where there's a lot of radiant heat, by putting short sleeves on someone, you can actually be increasing the heat load, because the shirt would provide some insulation factors from the heat, and you're now taking that off. So you're allowing direct radiant heat to go onto the skin and onto the blood vessels. So, yeah, again, it's not a simple black and white. You need to look at all these factors.
Yeah, having this conversation on the weekend, as we get older, you realize that there's no, not everything is binary, zeros and ones, or yes and no's, or, it's this or that. It's so so many different things, and so many people like are just looking for the answer, and it's like, it's like with the whole coronavirus thing. Oh, this test. It's like, well, what about the accuracy, the specificity and sensitivity? And people look at you cross-eyed going, what are you talking about? I'm like, well, what if the test is wrong? But it says they had coronavirus. I'm like, yeah, but what if it's a false positive? And they're like, what's that? I'm like, this is where we failed, guys. This is where we failed in school to teach people proper science,
Yeah.
So
and I think a lot comes back to the education process. And it's one thing I've always been a big fan of is this self-determination approach. You teach the individual what they need to know about what symptoms are and how their body reacts. They learn about how their body reacts to the heat, what they can cope with and what they can't cope with. And from there, they self-determine what's happening. And the average worker, normally you've got to try and stop them from working rather than them trying to bludger or anything like that. They want to work. They want to get the job done. But if they understand when their body's coming into significant strain, then they pull back. And they need to be able to identify these signs and symptoms. And we don't teach them that. We give them, this is when you're about to faint, or when you're cramping, or when you're delirious and dizzy. Well, that's too late. We need to teach them those early signs and how to, a 5-minute break here or there makes a hell of a difference. So, just an approach.
What about then, Ross, when some people take novel approaches in an organization where they go, oh, well, if we have people work in the evening or a night shift when the sun's not out, we completely lower our thermal stress load, or we do kind of weird rosters like midnight to midday. And obviously, like from a fatigue risk management perspective, that's really bad because we talk about chronobiology and so on. But some people go, we'll just push that aside for a thermal stress thing. It's better. Might be less managers around, less people. We can get jobs done. It's like an off-peak period, if it's in the railways, for example, or it's a road-related thing. What's your thoughts on sort of using that as an approach as well?
That is actually quite a valid approach, and I've recommended that at some sites. Often for some unknown reason, we do some of the hardest jobs in the hottest part of the day. So the planning of work. How often have you seen an outage, a major outage for a business or a site, and they do it in the middle of summer?
Yeah.
Why not postpone that to the middle of winter or later on? Introduction of doing some of the hotter tasks on night shift. I've used that on a number of occasions, and it's been very, very effective. Obviously, from your side of things, it can have an impact on how the body functions. But as far as from a thermal perspective, if you do the work in the cool part of the day, it makes more sense, particularly if you're doing work out in the open when, with the sun and that sort of stuff. So,
I think, Ross, actually, I think there's a happy medium where it's like you can design a roster, for example, that's got a proper night shift, like 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., for example, as a 12-hour one. You don't have to go 12 to 12 because you can get the chronobiology sort of thing in there. And then it's more about the work task design, as in when do we do these jobs, like you said. So why do we have to do jobs that are exposed to the elements, heat and wind and so on during the day, when particularly in coastal regions, when you got crazy issues going on, like let's say in agriculture, you got tarps blowing, so you're trying to battle a sea breeze in the afternoon at 3 o'clock. Why not do that job at like 2 a.m. when it's a southeasterly breeze? As an example here in Western Australia, when the wind is down, put that job there, put this job there. I think a lot of times in companies, when we come across these variables, things have just been done for no real reason for a long time, just because that's how we've always done it. And when you start then challenging the kind of status quo of the work management, people start looking around, well, why can't we? Why do we have to do like HV switching at 4 a.m. in the morning at the lowest time when we're, cognitively not aware? Why can't we do it at 12 o'clock noon from a control room in the comfort of, it's just that sort of like challenge those things. And I think it's trying to find a happy medium, between all those different variables, like we're saying, the roster, the thermal stress, the work balance, and
the actual environment too.
Environment as well, the wind, whatever it might be. So all those factors have to come into play to get that kind of optimal area. And it's not easy. And people think it's just like, oh yeah, we'll just do this. And it's not. It's difficult. So it's interesting you say that in some cases that's recommended, because I actually said the same thing. It depends on what you're trying to achieve, what you're trying to do, and where the risk exposure is across time.
I did an interesting job a number of years ago where they were constructing a large chemical containment vessel in Northern Australia, and it was actually on the coast, and they had the same issue. They had not only issues with heat, they also had issues with welding fume and the like, and they were doing the traditional, 7 o'clock. They were doing 10-hour shifts or whatever, and I said, well, why don't you, change it so that you're doing most of the hotter tasks at night? And there was no reason why they couldn't, because they had lighting and everything. The other benefit, though, we found was at a certain time, the sea breeze basically changed direction. And instead of blowing all the fume back into the vessel, by just changing putting up some barriers, they were able to direct the sea breeze. So it actually produced a nice cool breeze through the vessel. It was a very large vessel, and also helped with the ventilation of the fumes as well. So they didn't have to buy all these big fans and things to get the process, so that they were doing the dilution ventilation. They were using the natural ventilation in the change of the day, and used the fans only when there was no breeze. So it turned out to be a very productive exercise, simply by changing the time of the day they were doing the work. So it's quite clever.
Yeah, there's always things you can do that are low cost and effective as well. You don't have to spend millions of dollars to redesigning stuff. Like you're saying, or use those elements and timing of day.
It was just purely by chance, but it turned out to be quite good.
Yeah, it's good. Ross, in every scientific discipline that we talk about in this podcast, or anybody we have on, we always have a number of areas that we ask. Is this basically true, or is it bullshit? So it's not a rapid fire quiz, but I'm going to ask you one that comes up a lot when I deal with athletes. Pickle juice for cramps and heat stress. Have you heard of this?
I have heard of it. Pickle juice.
What do you think? I can't find any data on it.
The only thing I can think about with the pickle juice is possibly the salt content. So there would be pickle juice would have a significant level of dissolved salts in there. Yeah. Cramping is usually as a result of high loss of fluids and loss of salts. So what the pickle juice may do is just replace those salts. That's the only thing I can think of. I mean, short of getting doing a gas chromatography analysis of pickle juice and that sort of stuff, no, that's the only thing I can think of.
Yeah, I don't know. I couldn't find any scientific data. Lots of self-reported sort of things. But even with some of the athletes, it's the inter-athlete variability is quite high. Like some guys be like, oh yeah, I got cramps and had pickle juice and it was perfect. Other guys, I drank about a liter of that shit and it didn't do anything for me. And it was horrible. I thought I was going to throw up. So it's always interesting to see what would be recommended.
Yeah,
what is recommended, Ross, for people who are, sweating a lot and losing a lot of, let's say, salts, electrolytes? Because lots of people grab, like we said, energy drinks, sodas, start drinking coffees, teas. Some people are like, just get any fluid down you. What's kind of a good mix that people should look out for?
Oh, okay. Look, I tend to go for some of the more balanced drinks. Not so much the sports drinks.
Yeah.
They have their place, but you need to look at the actual balance of the carbohydrate and the sodium content, potassium content, and all sorts of things in there. What we tend to recommend for in a workplace is just drink plain water initially. If you know the job is going to be you're going to be doing a lot of sweating, then I would recommend you take some kind of electrolyte drink, without naming specific brands, but there are some good electrolyte brands out there that you don't necessarily want ones with a lot of sugar in them.
Ross, we're not the ABC here. If you have a brand that you think is good, you can name it. We're not the ABC.
Oh, okay then.
Yeah.
There's
because someone's going to be going, I wish you just said the brand. Just say the brand.
There's two that I tend to work with. One is my brain's not the best at the moment. It was developed by Curtin University. What was it called?
Not Aqualite, is it?
Aqualite, yeah.
I've seen that was used in some of the athletic groups I worked with. Aqualite, yeah.
Aqualite, and is it Gastrolite's the other one that
That's
I
right, yeah.
work with.
Yeah.
They're my preferred, purely because I know they've got a balanced amount in there. There's not a lot of sugar in them.
Yeah.
Because, obviously for the flavour, people like to put sugar in. But I would say drink mainly water and then top up, at the start of the day, partway through the day, towards the end of the day, top up with those electrolyte replacements to get those salts back up. We have to remember that our diets are usually pretty high in salt anyway. So we're going to have a fair amount of salt in there. So these are really just top ups. Sometimes I've had people, excuse me, say, "Oh yeah, but if you drink too much water, that can kill you too." Well, that can happen, but it's very rare that does happen. It's happened in some athletes. 2015, I can remember there were two athletes in the United States, gridiron or football players that suffered from hyponatremia, which is the illness, which is an increase in massive amount of water without replacing the salts, and then you get the swelling of the cells because of the increased water. But that would intravenous fluids, plus they were drinking 15 liters over a period of 3 hours, massive amounts of water. And there was a study done by two medicos from one of the local hospitals here in Brisbane, the Royal Hospital, on the Kokoda Trail. They had some fatalities on the Kokoda Trail, which they thought was as a result of dehydration. But when they went and did the study, they actually found it was most likely it was hyponatremia. They were overhydrating and not getting that salt balance. But the risk to hyponatremia compared to the risk to not enough fluid, they're quite a while apart. So I would say generally drink water and top up with electrolytes, but I wouldn't say you have to drink electrolytes all the time.
Yeah. Excellent, Ross. Excellent. So if lots of good information in there. If you're new to occupational hygiene, that's a great intro into it. I think a lot of people, don't know much about occupational hygiene. So that's a great introduction into what an occupational hygienist is and what you do. So Ross, if people want to get in contact with you, or you run your own business here in Australia, how can they get in contact with you? How can they find you?
Probably. The easy. We have a website, which is just a general website. It's monitorcs.com.au, and that covers with a number of areas that we work with. I also have a thermal blog, which is pretty easy to read. It's called thethermalenvironment.com, or one word, thethermalenvironment.com, and it picks up a lot of these topics that you've actually been questions that you've been raising today, and just gives you it's a non-technical sort of explanation of some of these areas. They're probably the two easiest ways of contacting me.
Yeah, and the thermal environment blog is also linked on your website under the blog tab as well. So in the show notes, if you scroll down there, if you're on a phone or you're on a website, you can just hit that link and go over there to Ross's website, Monitor. Quite clever, Monitor. There's actually a monitor there. You'd have to click on it to see what kind of monitor it is. Consulting services, so you can find out all about the services you offer there, contact you as well, and the blog, which people can check out here as well, and go back through all the archives as well and dig into that detail if you wish. So I think no matter who you are in terms of your work environment or an athlete, there's lots of stuff in here, lots of interesting and practical stuff, and also some links here to Ross being on other podcasts, such as the Safety of Science podcast as well. So lots of good information here for people to avail of freely.
Yeah, and just as one quick plug for the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists.
Oh, we can't promote any organisations, Ross, only products. No, I'm just...
So that is the professional the premier professional organisation for hygienists in Australia. And if you need information on hygienists, occupational hygiene, that's the place to go. aioh.com.au.
Yeah, they have some really good information there, and some they have a conference every year as well. I think I spoke at your conference a couple of years ago, which was quite good. It was quite well received. Some practical, questions there, which is quite good. I think the other good thing as well is we spoke earlier on about, people wanting to do occupational hygiene and they come from a different scientific background and end up doing a master's and so on. There is also a basic course you can do, which I undertook a number of years ago, which is I think it's a 40-hour course. So basically like 5 days. Okay, it's like a basic occupational hygiene principles course, believe it's called.
Basic principles of occupational hygiene.
Yeah, excellent course to give you particularly if you're in another area of health and safety. I think it was quite good for me to do, to kind of see all the different areas and understand what the hygienists do and how, I could work with a hygienist and how, there was crossover and overlap. So I think it's a very interesting course to do. Or if you're interested in becoming a hygienist or you're just trying to broaden your knowledge, even if you're not in the health and safety field, it's actually quite good. It's quite broad because, it covers all of these areas and a little bit more as well. So I really enjoyed that. I did that in Johannesburg, actually, a number of years ago, actually run by your colleague and my colleague, Mr. Ian Firth.
Yeah, that's right.
So Ian ran that course there. So that was quite good. So yeah, so I'd encourage people to look at that course as well if you're interested. Ross, is there anything else you would like to let our listeners know before we depart for Christmas?
No, I think we've had a good little chat this morning. It's good to catch up.
Yeah, it's excellent.
I think just to be aware that with heat stress, don't let it get to the point where you are seeing significant symptoms. You need to keep on top of it early in the piece, and keep your fluids up. And as soon as you start to recognize some of those symptoms, to act on it and cool yourself down wherever you can.
Excellent. Well, look, Ross, I think we may be having you back on the podcast again if you're willing. Maybe not to talk about heat stress, maybe not to talk about hygiene, but to talk about your new wood-fire pizza oven that you're currently experimenting with. So that's a little bit of a taster there to keep people hooked. And until next time, I was trying to come up with a saying there, because I normally say, like, when it's a sleep-related podcast, sleep well. What would you say to people? Stay cool.
Yeah.
Stay cool.
Stay cool.
Thanks, Ross.
Thanks, Ian. Catch you.